Well, welcome everyone to this media briefing ahead of the US elections. It's great you can join us. Lovely to see so many familiar faces in the journalist panel. We have just under a week to go. And I think it's fair to say there's rarely been an election where the sort of stakes have been more important, and not least in the domain of climate change and clean energy, where there could hardly really be more difference between the two candidates. And it's taking place, of course, against a really interesting backdrop where just within the last 5 weeks, we've seen first China and then Japan and just today, South Korea come forward with pledges on reaching carbon neutrality around mid-century. So a very different world into which the new president will be coming, irrespective of who it is. We have three experts here to give you some insights and answer your questions on what you think on what this means for the international picture on climate change and energy. What a Biden administration or Trump administration might do, how that feeds into this global picture, what actually is happening in the US anyway in terms of energy and climate, and then coming on to COP26, which would have been starting next week had COVID-19 not intervened. What does a Biden administration or a Trump administration mean for COP26? How could the UK best be engaging with either of those administrations? I say we've got three distinguished speakers. The invitation you had mentioned four, but I'm afraid to say that Professor Dan Cameron had to withdraw at the very last minute, so apologies for that. But hopefully we can cover the same points. I'll just briefly introduce the three speakers and then just say how we're going to play this. So Rachel Kite is Dean of the Fletcher School at Tufts University. She's a former CEO of Sustainable Energy for All and a special representative of the United Nations Secretary General for Sustainable Energy. Pete Betts is an associate fellow at Chatham House. He has spent many years, more years than he'd probably like me to say, directing international climate change policy for the UK government, and was also for 6 years lead negotiator for the EU. And Tom Tugendhat is MP for Tunbridge and Morling, been in Parliament since 2015. Tom's a former soldier, served in Iraq and Afghanistan, among other places, and now chairs the Foreign Affairs Select Committee in the UK Parliament. And for journalists joining who may not be so familiar with the workings of the UK Parliament, that's one of the committees that is able to scrutinise the work of government and make recommendations to government. So I'm going to ask Rachel, Pete and Tom to give us some sort of introductory thoughts and remarks, and then for the rest of the time it will be over to you. You're welcome at any time to stick a question in the Q&A box if you'd like. If you're on the phone and not on the app, then you can email us in a question at info@eciu.net, info@eciu.net. And when it comes to the time to ask your question or post your comment, we'll give you the option of either doing that in the Q&A if you like, or alternatively, if you want to come up on audio and ask the question, you'll be very welcome to do that. We are on the record, of course, for this media briefing. So let me, first of all, pass straight over to Rachel Kite.
Thank you, Richard. Hello, everybody. Greetings from a kind of grey Massachusetts. So less than a week to go, and every superlative has been used in terms of how important this election is. And I think that for the first time in modern American electoral history, we have a clear choice between candidates when it comes to climate, as Richard said. We have a Biden climate plan, which if you think of a nest of Russian dolls, it was a Jay Inslee plan that got added to with a bit of a Warren plan, and then got added to by other parties within the Democratic Party, and then has emerged as a Biden plan. It is aggressive, and it is at scale with the kinds of commitments that we're seeing from other large industrialized countries, the rest of the G7, and now increasingly members of the G20, as Richard also said. And then that's juxtaposed with an incumbent who has overseen an aggressive attack on environmental regulation over the last 3 to 4 years out of a playbook that was developed by a number of sort of right-leaning think tanks in Washington. And at the same time, a focused attack on any competition to fossil fuel energy. And so where does that leave us? Now, for the first time, climate change is discussed on the stump. Climate change is polling as an important issue, especially for younger people, including for young people within the Republican Party. The impacts of climate change are felt by every economic sector. And so this is a live issue in every state and every district. We've never been here before. We've even had intelligent climate change questions posed in presidential debates. But I think it is interesting that as the major powers, especially of Asia, with China, Japan, and Korea coming out with zero net emissions target announcements by 2050, building on what the EU had announced in September as well. There is a discernible moment here in the United States in the course of this election of, well, this is, and the phrase was coined in London, a race to zero. Do we need to be in this race? Can we be King Canute-like and push back a tide of investment, a tide of a clean energy transition? Do we need to be in this race in order to win it? Or can we just say that we don't want to have that race, we want to be in another race? And I think it'll be interesting to see where what remains of the Republican Party feels about clean energy if Trump were to win, because the competitiveness of the United States, if everybody else is putting a border tax adjustment on carbon, if everybody else is treating carbon as a bad, how do you in a global economy still operate with success if you are not doing anything to diminish your energy intensification? However, the stance of the incumbent belies what has really been going on in the American economy over the last 3 to 4 years. So the president can say that he doesn't like windmills, but the US wind capacity has increased from 83 gigawatts in 2016 to 106 gigawatts in 2019. We're now the second largest market for wind after China. He can push back on solar, but there was more utility scale solar installed in the first quarter of 2020 than accounting for 40% of electricity generation, and so the markets and the economy is moving in one direction. President Trump has spoken aggressively about defending jobs in the coal sector and wanting to see coal continue as a linchpin of the U.S. energy mix. But in the years that he has been in the White House, 337 gigawatts of coal capacity has been retired. That's more than was retired under Obama in his presidency. So the question, I think, is, can you deny that an energy transition is underway? Can you deny that a clean energy transition is underway? And then how would you exploit that? And of course, in a federal system, what states do actually matters as well. And we've seen states from obviously Democrat-led states embracing the clean energy transition, including California in the lead, but you've also started to see Texas, Arizona, Virginia, other states which have been purple or red, really moving forward, and the amount of investment quite impressive. So I think Florida, the first quarter of 2020, installed more solar than California. And these are stories that are not really held. I think the final point I want to make is that as you think about the economic recovery that will be necessary for anybody who wins next week to steer their way through, that economy, that recovery, that COVID recovery, is going to have to be a COVID recovery which pushes an economy onto a trajectory to achieve net zero by 2050. That's the debate that we see in Europe. That's the debate that's going on in the leading Asian economies. Here, because of the gridlock in Washington and the failure to agree a recovery plan, because of the politicized campaign, because of very different views about recovery, about the state of the pandemic, and about whether or not net zero is a target, we have two very different visions of what that recovery is going to look like. I think for Biden, clearly using the federal government to build back with, and he said this on the campaign stump, he said this in the debates, where do the good quality local jobs come from that will give you resilience at the local community level, give people jobs, build income over the medium term, and which help you get to net zero. That's very much part of the Biden team's thinking at the moment. And so emphasis on energy efficiency, building efficiency, investing in the infrastructure for electric vehicles, taking away, I think, the federal government's dissonance with California efficiency targets. So you'd expect to start to see some of those things happening. Obviously, you would see on day one an executive order, presumably, that would signal that the US would go back into the Paris Agreement and I think into the WHO, although that would take time then to underpin with legislation. So if Trump were to win, we're not at all sure what kind of recovery would be engineered through Congress recovery plans and from the White House, and that steer to states and cities that there are things that they could be doing and support for them to do it presumably wouldn't be there. So if at the international level, from the IMF, the UN to the OECD, if the discussion is using the COVID recovery to actually make ourselves more resilient and get on track for zero at 2050, I think that's very much something that would resonate with the Biden team, and the Biden team are keen to join into that conversation. That is not a conversation that the Trump team would be having. I'll stop there.
Lovely. Thanks so much, Rachel. Okay, Pete, over to you. You've worked with the UN climate process for many years, and COP26, as I say, would have been starting next week. We've got a year to go. How do you see things unfolding in the event of either a Biden or a Trump presidency?
Thanks very much, Richard, and afternoon, everyone. So basically what I'm going to argue is that, clearly in terms of securing ambitious outcomes from the COP process, then, a Biden presidency is more benign for the UK, for all kinds of reasons I'll explain. But actually, even if Mr. Trump is elected, there is a way through, and some of the politics have been shifting on that quite markedly, even over the last couple of months. And I'll talk a little bit about what those changes have been and how the UK can work with those. So I thought it might be just instructive just to start by casting our minds back to the run up to Paris, because what happened in 2014 was that the US and China announced their emission reduction targets together over a year in advance of Paris. Now, why did China do that with the US? And not, say, with France, who are hosting the COP? Well, I would say, and I'm being quite blunt here, China essentially cared more about the US relationship than it did about the EU, and it had more, and the US had more leverage with China. Secondly, China saw that as essentially a give to the US in a transactional relationship, and I guess the Americans also saw it as a give to them that the Chinese made that movement. The Chinese pledge was, lowballed. It was probably something that in some respects they would have done anyway through the decarbonization of the economy naturally. But nonetheless, we in the climate community welcomed it for a whole raft of reasons around them getting new targets. So that's what happened in 2014. And that has been certainly conditioning my analysis, but most people I talk to around what might happen this time round. So, for example, we knew that China was working on a long-term strategy, but my sense was that China would hold back its targets until it had seen who'd won the US election, and then it would play that its offers transactionally with the new US president in part of a wider conversation about investment and trade and so on. I was wrong, and so were most other observers. So, President Xi, in a rather skillful move in September in the UN, announced unilaterally a sort of credible long-term net zero goal for China. Now, why did he do that? I think a number of reasons. Firstly, a sort of successful desire to wrong foot Mr. Trump, who was going to call him out on climate. Secondly, I think arguably a greater sensitivity to, on the part of the Chinese foreign policy community, to reputational issues. I think there are those in the Chinese foreign policy community who worry about the wolf warrior strategy. Thirdly, I think it's sort of a growing recognition that sort of playing a developing country card. I mean, that China sees themselves developing country card, but using that as a rationale for sort of low ambition is less credible given the relative weight of the Chinese economy. Fourthly, I think it was, although EU wasn't mentioned, and although the EU didn't know it was coming, I think it was in a kind of way a give to the EU, because the EU had just been asking them for that. And I think it was a signal that the China wants to work with the EU and it doesn't want a Western united front. And finally, I would say it was a sign of President Xi's authority to make very quick decisions without reference to the wider Chinese leadership, because that decision appears to be made at the last moment very quickly. And that has triggered some quite massive announcements. So following that, we've had a net zero announcement both by Japan and Korea in the last few days, which we weren't expecting so soon. That's a big shift. Meanwhile, in spite of COVID and all the way that's crowded out the political space, the EU are moving ahead, and I think it's pretty likely they will adopt a 55% target in December, which a 55% reduction target, which is extremely ambitious and much more ambitious than even the EU were talking about 6 months ago. So that's the landscape. So what could what difference the US election makes? I guess one thing that will be the same whoever wins is that there will be a more difficult relationship with China whoever wins, but almost everything else on climate will be different. So if it's Mr. Biden, I think climate will be a very high priority. Obama didn't prioritize climate particularly in his first term. I think Biden will, because it's much more central to his political strategy, to his whole campaigning and to the coalition he's built. I think they'll quickly rejoin Paris. I think they'll provide some climate finance. I think their new target will come, but it might take a bit of time. Might be later in the year before it emerges. I think Biden has said he will convene the major emitters, including at leader level, very quickly. He said in the first 100 days, we'll see. I think that the Americans will lean on their allies, Japan, Canada, Australia, others, to raise their ambition. And I think they'll do that. I think that the US are getting increasingly close to India, and I could foresee some kind of US-India collaboration, win-win announcement. And then the question is China, and can the US, in a context of a scratchier relationship, find a space with China where they can basically cooperate on this area, around things like debt, because China is now the biggest creditor in the world, border tariff adjustments, things like that. Or if not, might you see a competitive scenario where they both try and compete for international plaudits, for influence in developing countries through climate action. If it's Mr. Trump, then clearly he will go ahead and withdraw from Paris and continue to roll back domestic action. Clearly the US will not be using their diplomatic weight with some other countries to raise their ambition. But what would China do? Given China's already moved, I think you could foresee a scenario where China goes ahead and announces its target. I think that both the EU and China will see attractions in working together in this space. The EU's been trying to do it with China for years, and there's some signs now China might do so. So you could foresee a scenario where things move on. I don't think anyone will follow Mr. Trump out of Paris. Nobody has in the last 4 years, and I don't think they will in the future. So I think that's basically how I see things. I think if I think if it is Mr. Biden, it clearly makes the UK's task much easier. And I think there's clearly a sense that he's an area where the UK and US can work together very closely, perhaps leveraging the broader relationship beneficially. If it's Mr. Trump, then clearly, we want to have an understanding, we're going to continue, but, we note the position of the US. I think there's a very strong real economy story, as Rachel was saying, that a lot of this stuff is happening anyway. It's just happening anyway, that renewable energy, electric vehicles and so on. And I think that the UK will be wanting to reinforce those trends with some real economy coalitions and so on. In summary, I think that there are ways through on both, but clearly in a Biden scenario, that there's scope for more rapid action globally on climate next year.
Right. Thanks very much. Thanks very much, Pete. Okay, on to you, Tom. Obviously, US, UK, one thinks of the special relationship, one thinks also of trade deals and so on at the moment. How do you see this picture evolving under either a Biden or Trump presidency, and how do you think the UK government should be playing it?
Sorry, there we go. The key element for the UK government is, of course, the imminent COP26 talks and what that will mean for the UK, of course, as diplomatic leverage around the world, but also what it will mean for the climate challenge. Now, there are many elements of the COP26. The first is that we've got a bit more time, of course, because it was supposed to be earlier this year, or rather round about now. What am I talking about? Round about now that we were supposed to be, every day, is it just me, or does every day seem to have blended into one for the last 6 months? We've got a bit more time. So the promises that we were looking to get in the run-up to COP26 now may actually be achievable in a way that they weren't when the government started looking at this in January. Now, I hope that this will mean that there is a real opportunity. The previous two speakers are absolutely right that, of course, it depends on the President of the United States as to how effective some of it will be. But I'm going to ask some counterintuitive questions that I hope may raise the discussion rather than giving my opinion, because I'm not quite sure I've got the answers. The first is that, funnily enough, I'm not sure that Trump has been quite as unhelpful as all that. Is it not possible that actually what Trump has been doing, what President Trump has been doing in his challenge with China, is actually onshoring, or rather bringing back labor that has been powered by coal into jurisdictions that are powered by wind or nuclear in Western Europe, in the United Kingdom, and indeed in the United States. Given how much carbon offshoring has had an impact on our environment over recent years, has this perhaps helped a bit? Now, I understand what the reaction will be, which is, of course, questioning whether or not the United States couldn't have done more at home. And of course, that's true. But in a funny way, isn't the clash between federal and state level administrations in the United States that President Trump has brought about, certainly in places like California, triggered some of the rush to green that we've seen at state level administrations, that perhaps has actually pushed the United States further ahead than it would have been had it been a federal project. Now, of course, Vice President Biden, who may, at the end of this year, be President Biden, would be much more likely to have a proper federal project to deliver this. But one of the things that we have found with Vice President Biden, is he talks very strongly about the international cooperation. That is very hard to achieve. And if he didn't achieve it, would he freeze or would he go it alone? And one thing about President Trump is he tends to go things alone. Admittedly, this is not a direction to which he's been drawn. But if a future President Biden weren't able to get international cooperation, would it indeed lead to others deciding to go it alone, or would they all slow down because at last it was a US president they felt that they had to work with? I think there are different ways of looking at this, and I'm not quite sure we're always right in assuming that a greener White House, as it were, necessarily implies a greener world. I think there are moments when a tension between the White House and the world could in fact lead to different outcomes, and indeed more people, for example, following COP26 if it was seen as an anti-Trump move. So I think that there are possible different ways of looking at this. But let's have a look at it. Let's look at it in the straight sense and just say correctly that President Trump has shown no great impetus towards environmental diplomacy, and President Biden has. Let's assume President Biden wins. What do we expect to happen next? Well, I think that the major things that we expect to happen next is for the UK government to use COP26 and indeed environmental diplomacy as a way of leveraging a special relationship that would otherwise be frankly difficult. This current administration's relationship with the Trump White House has been closer than I think many in the Democratic caucuses would like to see, and indeed our own Prime Minister's relationship with the former President Obama has led many who are in the outer, as it were, the outer reaches of this administration to have different views about Prime Minister Johnson and different views about Brexit agenda and various other elements of the agenda. And so the reality is, I think environmentalism offers the UK a way back towards a closer relationship with the Biden White House. And I think we may see, in fact, if we're sensible, what we will see is we will effectively see the UK offering the Biden White House sharing a very, very generous share of the COP26 talks in order to bring them in. Will it work? I don't know. But at the moment, given the frostiness of the relationship between the putative White House and the actual number 10, it does seem as though something will be needed. Now, what happens if President Trump wins? Well, it's certainly true that COP26 will prove difficult and that some of the natural Trump allies will be closer to following the Trump agenda, countries like Brazil, perhaps. But let's not forget that a second-term US administration always feels like a dead duck within months of arriving in office. And so it starts to try and internationalize. So what would a Trump White House do? Well, I'm not going to try and answer that question because I don't know. But I do know that other countries will be looking around to the future as well. So I'm not quite sure things are quite as black and white as we think.
Thank you so much, Tom. Wonderful. So that's opening remarks from the three panelists. Just a reminder, if you would like to ask a question, please do either put it in the chat or in the Q&A box. If you're not on the app, but you're joining on the phone, you can send us an email, info@eciu.net. And if you'd like to ask your question, in person by coming up on audio, that's completely fine. Equally, if you'd like me to just read it out, that's completely fine as well. So let me take a first question, if I may now, which is coming from Suzanne Ehlerding, who I believe is with Tagesspiegel in Germany. And Suzanne asks, I would like to ask the panel how good the Biden plan is and how high are the chances that he would get the necessary money from Congress to implement it. That sounds like one for you, Rachel, if you're able to take that.
Thanks. Well, look, beauty's in the eye of the beholder. I think that if you're in the Sunrise Movement, it doesn't go far enough. If you are one of the if you're a sort of Obama Democrat, then it's more than any candidate has ever put on the table before. And certainly it has things in there which begin to recognize that the world that Biden would come into if he were president is not sort of the same world that he left 4 years ago with just 4 years gone on. As Tom and others have said, the relationship with China, the US relationship with China, the US relationship with the EU, post-Brexit, then relationship with the UK. I mean, these have all changed, right? So it is a different scenario into which to be coming. I think that I think it's good in that it's comprehensive. So you've got everything in there. You've got energy, you've got transport, you've also got land use, the beginning of a discussion around land use and management and paying farmers to protect carbon in soils, etc. So I think that's good. Getting it right sized between what do you need at the federal level, what do you need at the state level, how do you unleash market forces? I think that there are things that are very important at the federal level that you see glimpses of in there. There has been a downtick in R&D, federal support of R&D, which is actually very, very important for the new technologies, the hydrogen economy, etc. And that's there. That would be a return to normal. And some of these things enjoy bipartisan support. It included like the way that finance would flow internationally. You've seen recently the International Development Finance Corporation, which is the external aid lending arm of the US government now, in the last few months, just turned into a something that will subsidize rather inartly domestic industries to do domestic things. That I think that you would expect to see under the Biden plan those things going back to their mission. And this used to be a place where billions of dollars of assistance were going into building up renewable energy in Africa, etc. So it's not bad. It's not enough. And actually, the thing to watch for is in the election, the left wing or the progressive element, the young people who've been so mobilized around climate have basically put a Band-Aid, as they would call it in the United States, or a sticking plaster over their mouth. And even if they're not happy with the responses that he's given or with the stump speech, they're just biding their time because they want Biden over Trump. As soon as he's elected, then you're going to see a lot of pushing and shoving over who holds cabinet positions, how that plan actually gets enacted. And then we would have to see the color of the Congress. And I think that for most observers here, it's not just about the presidency, it's about the Senate. And obviously a Mitch McConnell Senate versus whoever would be the leader of the Democrats in the Senate if it were to go. So that actually perhaps in some ways is even more consequential, although I'm intrigued by Tom's discussion of whether the Trump baby blimp at COP26 is more useful than the actual head of state himself, but that's for another conversation.
Tom, actually, there's a supplementary question that perhaps follows on from that one, maybe of particular interest to UK-based journalists, which is in Brexit world, the kind of prospects of a trade deal with the US has been sort of held up as a big sort of token of success of Brexit. We haven't seen it, obviously, up until now. A Biden administration pushing ahead with clean energy. What does that do you think, for prospects of that trade deal? How might it look?
Well, I mean, people will have been hard put to hear me praising the idea of a US-UK trade deal, largely because I don't think it's either likely or desperately beneficial. The great advantage of being two of the most open economies in the world is actually, as far as trade deals go, we don't have many barriers to take down. So we're in a very different position. And the only barriers we have to take down are the ones that are really hard to move, which are agricultural. Which have very, very strong vested interests. So I'm not sure I'm going to go there, I'm afraid, with you, Richard, on trade deals. I think it's another red herring, of which there have been quite a few in British politics in the last 4 or 5 years. I think the real challenge, though, is how do we cooperate if indeed we end up in a Biden-Johnson relationship over green energy. And I think that's a challenge, because actually we do have very different interests. And if you look at the way that the UK, for example, is going into nuclear, admittedly Hitachi pulled out, but actually the French EDF plans and the Chinese TGN plans, if they go through, there are several of us who feel that would be a bad idea. But if they do go through, then we'll put Britain on a very different course to the United States, where GE's nuclear technology is not currently at the same level, and there's certainly no strong indication the US is going down the same route. Now, whether or not this means that the US and the UK will proceed down various things that we can do together, wind and so on, I don't know. I mean, the UK has gone very much for offshore wind, which is now beginning to generate quite serious quantities of energy. The United States is going in subtly different directions, doing quite a lot of onshore wind. And it'll be interesting to see what this means for various other aspects, and whether Biden is willing to take on shale gas and many other different greener, but certainly not green energy solutions.
Yes, that's right. The US has, if I can use the phrase, dipped its toe in the waters of offshore wind, hasn't it? But not to a massive degree. Pete, can I come to you now? A couple of questions that I'd like to put together, I think, because they fit quite well together. Question from Isabel Gerritsen at Climate Home. When do you think we can expect a 2030 NDC from a Biden administration, which I think plays into what you were saying earlier about the way that diplomacy is used here. And then another question from someone, and I'm not sure who's asked this, it's just coming up as anonymous attendee. What's the minimum Paris target that a Biden administration must put forward to be viewed as credible by the international community?
Yeah, thanks very much, Richard. So I think so. The whole team around Mr. Biden, if it is Mr. Biden, have been extremely tight-lipped for good reason, and so I think everything that I'm going to say is speculation. But I think a general sense is that the US will not want to rush under Biden, wouldn't want to rush out with a number. They would want to really think through what they could deliver, try to build a bit of consensus around it. So my sense is they would want to come out later in the year. I think any later than Glasgow would be a problem for them diplomatically, particularly if they were trying to engage diplomatically with China and others, if they didn't have a target themselves. So my guess is, second half, maybe third quarter of the year. I don't know. Clearly, what they can do depends on the Senate to some degree, as Rachel said. Even if they win the Senate, the people they're gonna, the sort of the seats they're going to pick up are in places like West Virginia and Montana, where the senators are kind of conservative Democrats, as it were, and they certainly have fossil fuel interests in their state. So I don't think there's going to be a rush to get rid of gas, for example, shale gas. So I think that's going to constrain things, but I do think that they will. My guess is, and Rachel knows this better, my guess is they will get the stimulus bill through Congress, no matter who wins, because there'll be too much in it for everybody around infrastructure and so on. So later in the year, I would have thought. On the second question, what should the number be? Well, there's a fair bit of thinking going on there, and depends who you ask. The current US offer is 26 to 28% reduction by 2025 on a 2005 base. The EU is likely to go for 55% in 2030. We don't know what the
That's
UK,
from a 1990 base as well.
From a 1990 base. The UK is still working on its number, but we know quite large numbers are being considered. So, I think there, from a climate perspective, one would look for a pretty high number from the US of that, because they are very big historic emitters. They're a rich country with lots of capacity and so on. On the other hand, I'm sure the US will argue, well, we are where we are. We've got issues around how we can get things through Congress and so on. But, I think something very, very substantially north of 26 to 28 would be needed to sort of satisfy the international community.
Great, thanks very much, Pete. Now let's move over to Isabel Hilton, who's editor of China Dialogue. Lovely to talk to you as always, Isabel. I've done this thing where I'm allowed to permit you to talk. So I've permitted you to talk. So hopefully, if you unmute yourself, we should all be able to hear you.
Extremely Chinese.
Well, it is rather. Thank you for graciously permitting me to talk. I wanted to prod a little at where climate fits into a generally unfavorable geostrategic configuration. It's kind of been, for Rachel, it's kind of been my assumption that climate would be a positive pathway as it was, with Obama-Xi, even if the US-China relationship wasn't so warm. But I guess it's equally possible that things will be so toxic that climate will suffer. And for Pete, you talked about positive movement on the EU-China collaboration, but what, beyond the rhetorical, what could EU-China cooperation really look like on climate?
Thank you, Isabel. Rachel, do you want to take your bit of that first?
Yeah, well, Isabel, you're the expert. I think that there's always a tendency in the United States on all sides of the political spectrum to sort of assume that the world is sort of waiting for the US to come back into the game, and then the US will take the ball and run down the field. And there's been some interesting, I think, back channel and sort of talks in recent weeks where some of the people close to the Biden campaign, not in the campaign, I wouldn't say, have sort of said, well, Biden victory, January, we can, the world can, we will spur the world forward. And I think, first of all, I think that the key relationships have shifted. I think the world's view of the United States has dimmed a little bit. And then I think that there is fundamentally no unanimity in the Democratic Party about what the relationship with China should be. And so you're going to see a fairly substantial, I think, tussle in the foreign policy team, and the finance team, and then the foreign policy team, the finance team, and the climate team. And I think it will be important who takes the helm at the National Security Council, who is the Secretary of State. Some of the names that are being mentioned have not traditionally been bold on climate. There's also discussion about whether or not there would be a climate envoy appointed. And then you have a reprise of an envoy who's pushing very hard, and then it's people sitting back in the White House pulling back a little bit. And then I think, how climate, this also depends on how the Chinese, who I agree played a very deft hand in September with their announcement, because they've come out with an aggressive announcement without saying what they're doing to coal in the next few years, and did get a step forward over the US. But I think that how trade works, how climate works within that, what that means for how Article 6 gets cleared out of the way, and Pete will explain all of that to you. But the Chinese are pushing very, very hard for a quick resolution on Article 6, presumably because they need that in order to be able to continue to trade with the EU without border tax adjustments. How the US works on all of that, I mean, I think this is all to be seen, but I think it's a lot thornier, a lot more difficult, and there is no settled view within the Biden team or within the Democratic Party. So this is entering into a new era and not going back to the era that existed 4 years ago.
Pete, I distinctly saw a hospital pass there from Rachel. Pete, please explain Article 6 to us.
I could if you wanted me to. I'm not sure. It's basically the legal basis for the carbon market, but I'm a bit skeptical we really need the detailed rules in any case. But anyway, that's so this question of what would an EU-China cooperation look like in reality? So as with US-China, the relationship between EU and China has become more suspicious over the last few years for a whole raft of reasons. More concerns about intellectual property, about trading and investment practices, as well as the sort of broader issues around human rights and so on. So, it's not credible on either side to think there could be some kind of grand partnership. And, I sometimes see that suggested, and I think that's not realistic. Equally, those countries are, as the Americans are, in competition essentially for influence in third countries in the developing world and so on. So on the other hand, as Rachel said, the Chinese have not, they've put forward a very promising long-term goal. We don't yet have a target for 2030. What China does in the next 10 to 15 years matters far more than anybody else in climate. They're bigger than the EU, the US, Japan put together. So they simply matter more. So there's that. But I suppose I hope this isn't naive, because I've been a bit of a skeptic on this, but I do think if you look at the Europeans are now getting serious about border tax adjustments. I think they are going to bring forward legislation next year. In the past, the China has seen that as a hostile act, and have become extremely angry, and it led to sort of threats not to buy Airbus when international aviation was brought into the emissions trading scheme and so on. I mean, actually, there's good case for a border tax adjustment if you've got a very high carbon price. It's a perfectly rational thing to do. So ideally, one would see that as a conversation between EU and China, where you would try and design the rules. You would try and say, well, what does this look like? What would be an appropriate level of this? How does it fit within a trading system? And a sort of, I don't think that's so what is a level playing field in a context where some countries are adopting extremely stringent standards and requirements on reducing emissions? That feels to me like an extremely sensible conversation to have, and it could be done EU-China, but it could also be done EU-China-US, or even EU-China-US-UK.
This brings me onto Tom. So I just wanted to get your views on this as well, because of course China is not exactly flavour of the month at the moment in UK politics for all kinds of reasons, from Huawei to Hong Kong, etc. And yet we could be in this weird situation next year where, on most issues, the UK and US are much closer than UK and China. But under a Trump presidency, the UK might actually find itself quite close to China in climate change terms and wanting to be part of that picture with the EU. But on the other hand, still at loggerheads with China on many other issues. I mean, how do you see the UK playing that one?
Well, I think climate change is one of those standalone issues. I mean, look, we're never going to side with China on the use of slavery, as they're doing in Xinjiang or Tibet, or the genocide or attempted genocide of the Uyghur Muslim population, the compulsory sterilization of women, the mass incarceration of Christians, Falun Gong, and Muslims. I can keep listing, by the way, human rights violations that separate us from the Chinese dictatorship that calls itself a communist party, but is actually just a plain Han fascist movement, a nationalist, vicious, ethnocentric movement in the guise of a communist administration. But the truth is they are facing similar problems to us. And in fact, the whole world is. And the truth is that if you look at the eastern seaboard of China, you're starting to see sea level rises causing the salinization of the rice growing areas. You're seeing the degradation of farmland on the edges of the desert. You're seeing the pollution in towns causing constant low-level protests that sometimes emerge into riots, but usually don't, in towns across China. So we're seeing a country that is really on the edge of climate disaster itself. So it's hardly surprising that they're beginning to realize that actually they need to change their policies. There are many other countries, by the way, not all of them dictatorships, who are also realizing that they are on the brink of climate failure, and therefore beginning to look differently at how they act. And I think that the UK needs to work with all these countries on climate change and to encourage them down the right direction as much as possible. I mean, let's be honest, there's very little we can do about them murdering Uyghur Muslims, which they're doing with a gusto and a willingness, which is frankly disgusting to see, and nobody has done since 1939. But that doesn't mean that we shouldn't look to cooperate in areas where we can reduce the evils that are affecting us all.
Thank you so much, Tom. Now, Kira Taylor from Euractiv, you wanted to come up as well and ask your question, which is fantastic. I've also promoted you to allow talking as well. So off you go.
Yeah, hopefully you can hear me.
We can. Lovely.
Right. So I guess my question is probably to Rachel mostly. If Joe Biden wins, how likely is it that he will phase out oil and gas, particularly looking at sort of the political of those industries, and what does he need to be able to do that, and if you can, a date for when those would be phased out?
No, I don't have a specific detail in that way, but I can talk a little bit about it. I think that first of all, just the mention of an energy transition in the last presidential debate set off an absolute furor, because you had talking points for the Trump team and their news channels, sort of saying, "Oh, that was a major gaffe." He's talking about the end of oil, and then you had a sort of a group of people around, close to Biden or in the middle, or observers who were like, "Oh my God, how do we explain that?" And then you had part of the Trump, the Biden team, and others sort of saying, "Actually, it wasn't a gaffe. We are in a transition." And of course, I think the education of the American political body and just the general population about what's happening in the energy sector in the country is really important, because that's when you start to see that coal's on its way out at rapid pace, that in fact the performance of the fracking industry is nowhere near as rock solid as you would imply. And of course, Pennsylvania is a swing state, and so yes, you have to talk about the how you eventually transition out of fracking. And of course, Joe Biden, I think in one of his other discussions, I think with George Stephanopoulos, talked about using carbon capture, storage and use in Pennsylvania as part of the transition. And most observers would indicate that that's not economically viable. So does he, because he needs a just and smooth transition, try to get support for public money to do those kinds of things, or are there other ways in which to secure the justness? I think what you see is that the debate around the parts of the fossil fuel industry is not coming back. There'll be huge pressure on Biden to actually phase out some of the subsidies, but those are very much supply, not demand subsidies here in the US, and they're very sort of state specific: Louisiana, Texas, Oklahoma, etc. You're going to see pressure on him to get out of fossil fuel subsidies, which is something that the G7, G20 said that they would do before Paris. You're going to see pressure on him to do that. How he does that, how quickly he does it, and then what support measures he puts in place for dislocated communities in heavily carbonized parts of the country is where the wrestling is going to take place. But this country is suffering at the moment in that conversation hasn't really been enjoined. And it's a difficult conversation. Look at Alberta, look at other parts of the world, but it needs to take place. The green energy piece of this, that's taking off already. And I think what's really important is where the stock market is and where the investors are. So that the extraordinary drumbeat of announcements coming out of big investors, asset owners, asset managers, that's really beginning to have an impact here. And then also the fact that some of the oil and gas stocks are really doing very, very poorly. You've had a series of bankruptcies over the last few months. So when you put it all together, you see this picture of the transition really underway. And so the role of the federal government is to step in, bring people around the table and talk about how do we smooth that. That's going to require a fairly substantial rhetorical and a conversation with the country, because that is not the conversation that's going on at the moment. And it'll be interesting to see whether Biden fireside chats, or and hopefully avoiding the sort of cardigan speech that Jimmy Carter made about energy efficiency, because it isn't about sacrifice. There are more jobs in the green sector than there are in the brown. You're going to see all of that happen. I think everybody's waiting to see, obviously, the election results, but you'll be able to see how this transition plays out in local races in certain states. This isn't happening to everybody equally across the country. So I will just leave it there. But I think that it's urgent, and it will mean that the conversation between the federal government and states has to be one around, how do you manage the just transition? I think that's what the conversation will be, as opposed to sort of not discussing a just transition.
I think you're speaking, Richard, but none of us can hear you.
Some would say that's a big advantage, Tom, but thank you very much. Yes, I muted myself there. It's a related question, Rachel, while we're on this topic, from Michael Holder of Business Green. You've dealt with some of this as well, but maybe a few other bits to come out. How serious is Biden about actually enacting the climate policies on his platform, asks Michael, and how likely is he to get through the key elements of it, such as net zero targets and big investments through the Congress?
Yeah, just very quickly, and then I let others. I think that I think he's serious. Got no reason to believe that he's not serious. I think Kamala Harris, who has not been a big proponent of climate issues, has got up to speed very quickly and has a good team around her as well. So I think she's serious. And honestly, if you're looking at where votes are, then young people's opinions in this country are not much different than young people's opinions in other industrialized countries. And so if the Democratic Party is steering to the future, then it's steering in that direction, notwithstanding steering to the future. I think the final thing to say is that remember that the Democrats are elected by Black Americans in large number. And there is a distinct justice piece of the climate debate which has come forward because of COVID. So you are more likely to die if you don't have access to clean air. So there is an ability to tie the injustice or tie environmental justice to need to act on climate, and you've seen that sort of quite articulately done at the local level in many countries. So the trick almost is for if Biden is elected, and that's an if, right, that he can capture and maintain this sort of momentum that's been building at the grassroots level around racial justice, climate justice, etc. And that's a real thing, which unites nurses and farm workers and students. And so they're going to want to try to keep that going. And if they do that, and if they've made progress both in the House and, of course, if they win the Senate, I think if they don't win the Senate, then you're going to see a very complex set of calculations around how much executive order, how much legislation, how much just letting the market and encouraging the market and sending signals. And of course, Obama was criticized for using executive orders too much. And of course, Trump came in and, did the same. So this will be a complicated set of calculations for a potential Biden administration, in particular if they don't win the Senate.
Tom, did you want to come in there?
Well, I'm just going to, I think actually Rachel's really covered it. I can't see split ticket voting being a particularly big thing. It never usually is. So I suspect that whoever wins the presidency will win the Senate, and the indications are that will give the Democrats, if Biden wins, a 50 seat plus one, of course, the vice president majority in the Senate, and therefore I can't see any particular reason either for doubting Biden's seriousness or his ability to deliver.
Interesting.
Maybe just to come back on that. So I agree. I don't doubt Mr. Biden's seriousness. I think that this is clearly it's a priority, and the whole coalition he's built depends on it. But as I said before, even if he wins the Senate, the sort of 2 or 3 that he might get over the line, over 50, are likely to be in places like West Virginia and Montana, states with strong fossil fuel industries. So, they'll need to be, as Rachel was suggesting, they'll need to build constructive coalitions, think about, transitions and other opportunities for these places. I do think the stimulus package is important because it offers the scope for significant funds for things like infrastructure, low carbon infrastructure, which can bring benefits to some of these, poor, often quite poor places like West Virginia, which also rely on only really have one industry.
Can I just jump in? If you look at the states that are really up for grab for the Senate, you've got Maine, where if the Democrat were going to win, then I think you would see a different conversation, and that's really important for offshore wind. It's also important for the pipelines coming potentially and transmission lines coming from Canada into the US. So there's critics of Susan Collins, the current senator that, you know, her husband's business interests and everything get in the way. I don't know if that's true, but I mean, it would be a fresh start. Colorado, your choice between Cory Gardner and John Hickenlooper is huge. Hickenlooper, as the mayor of Denver, really advanced electric mobility, lost a few things, but really is very persuaded. And of course, Colorado is losing more than 5% of GDP a year to forest fires at the moment, with extraordinary fires in the last 10 days. Then in Arizona, you have an opportunity to put you know, a middle of the road astronaut who completely understands climate change into the Senate. So these are important races, and you know, could give us a set of senators that bring actually real experience to the table on climate if the Democrats were to win.
Interesting point you made earlier, Rachel, about young people, and I just wondered if, Tom, you had any reflections on that, because I think it was a few years ago the Conservative Party in the UK realised how much young people did actually care about this issue. And I think it was a bit of a revelation, wasn't it, at the time?
Well, I think it's. I mean, I think it's a few years ago that the Conservative Party began to care about it for many rather obvious reasons, which is, you know, most of us are now under 50. Forgive me, but so we've grown up in the era of, you know, of the climate being a big issue. I mean, you know, we're all children of David Attenborough, right? I mean, and the reality is that this is something that has stuck. And then there's a few other things that have hit home pretty hard in recent years, and David Cameron picked up on this, and others have. And most recently, the Blue Planet, you know, on plastic pollution and various other things. So, you know, this is something that we're all very focused on. And it's, I mean, I keep hearing it being said as a young people's issue, a young person's issue. I have to say, politically, I don't notice that. I do notice it's a pretty universal issue. I mean, I don't know whether that's just Tonbridge and Malling, where I represent, but certainly when we asked for feedback, as we're doing some work on environmental diplomacy in the Foreign Affairs Committee that I'm privileged enough to chair, it's quite clear to me that we're getting responses from around the country, from you know, age groups as diverse as you'd expect. I mean, it's certainly not it's not being seen as a young person's issue anymore. So I don't think it's as much of a wake-up call as people think. I think, you know, people are just aware of it.
Pete, I think a question probably for you from Carl Matthijssen, who's now at Politico, having spent a long time at Climate Home. And as you expect from Carl, it's a rather insightful question. Beyond setting targets, what major political dynamics will govern global climate politics in the coming years? In other words, what's everyone going to fight about once everyone sets their NDCs and their long-term goals?
I'd certainly flag up sort of resilience. You know, I do think that you know, we're seeing the impacts on many countries, all countries, but it's obviously it hits the poorest countries most, and we've probably neglected that theme a bit over the years. And you know, much of public finance is channeled towards international public finance helping countries reduce their emissions, whereas, and very little, UK is an honourable exception here, very little is focused on helping countries build their resilience. I think that plays into the debt debate. You know, many vulnerable countries are extremely indebted, and that level of indebtedness has risen over recent years, and you know, at the same time, foreign exchange income is falling, so they're facing extremely high interest rates. And if you want to build a low carbon, climate resilient economy, it's capital intensive, and these countries are finding it harder and harder to borrow. So I think there will, you know, I think particularly if Biden is elected, you could imagine a conversation internationally about debt. And of course, China is by far the biggest creditor, but also Western banks are often co-invested. And I think, you know, Rachel knows a lot more about this sort of world than I do, but I think that is a really important theme to address. And I think along with spending public finance, we need to get much better. And I think that this is happening about how do you mobilize private finance into resilience, an area, by the way, where the UK has, you know, has probably got as much expertise as anywhere in the world. So I think that will be a really big theme. I could name others, but maybe that's one just to get us started.
Yeah, Tom or Rachel, would you have any reflections on that?
Tom, do you want to go first?
After you.
Okay. Well, I think there's much. I think that the adaptation and resilience are sort of run behind mitigation, and for lots of good and bad reasons. So you really do need a it sounds, I don't want to sound Pollyanna, but I mean you actually do need multilateral discussion about how do you make sure people don't get left behind in the international dimension. And the US has played a very important role in those conversations at key moments over the last 20 to 30 years. And you kind of need them back at the table again. And I agree on the point on debt. And I think you've got a number of ideas that are on the table at the moment. Well, first of all, you've got the capacity of the IMF, which has been stymied by the current administration. So one would have to believe that if there would be enormous pressure on a Biden administration to either change policy regarding the issuing of additional special drawing rights at the IMF, that money is needed to bail countries out of their COVID problems, but they need that in order to then be able to invest to become cleaner and greener. Secondly, there's ideas floating around climate debt swaps. There's a proposal from the African countries around a repurchasing scheme where European central banks would buy African debt. And then there are other ideas, recent really good stuff on sovereign performance bonds. You're going to need the US in all of that. And the second thing is on the private sector side, where Mark Carney now stepped down from the Bank of England and advising the Secretary General, is really pushing on transparency and mandatory reporting for banks, mandatory portfolio exposure to carbon reporting. That starts to catch lots of African and Asian companies in the sort of transparency around climate risk web. And again, you'd really want the US there. And so there's a role for the SEC, the financial regulator of the US, to sort of get the US caught up a little bit on where the central bank conversation is going. So the US role on the FSB, the US role in the IMF, the US role across the MDBs will be important. And then as we've been on this, chat, the US has just blocked the appointment of the first African woman to be the head of the World Trade Organization, and that will get resolved over the next couple of weeks. But the WTO becomes important as well, because for all of the trade and climate relations. So all of this matters to resilience, because we have to sort of help some of the countries that are poorer and at a different point in their development history. They just don't believe that the money and the resources and that the system is there to support them. They have lots of reasons to be skeptical. And if that's going to change, then you need the US at the table.
Yeah, look, I think the debt question and the reformation that it allows, if it is freed up, is an interesting one, because actually there's an awful lot behind it, and you've heard some excellent points there from Rachel and Peter. I wonder whether there isn't an extra element to this, which is the changing nature of finance, as we've seen so much of it going Chinese for very obvious reasons in recent years, and quite a lot of people now talking about how that may or may not see a different form of internationalization of debt under different regimes. So I have to say, it's a question I think is still much more open than I think it initially appears, and I think there's many ways in which this could play out.
Excellent, thank you. Let me change tack a little bit, because I think we've been talking for the last sort of 15-20 minutes implicitly about what may happen in the event of a Biden win. But Jess Shankelman from Bloomberg says, I'm still not clear what a Trump win would mean for climate change and green energy. Can you, between the three of you, paint a clear picture? Perhaps we can start with the diplomacy. Pete, that's your bag, I think.
Yeah, so I mean, I think that it's, I tried to say this maybe not very clearly at the beginning, that although I think it's a sort of more benign scenario for progress on climate under Biden, I still think it's inevitable that this agenda will progress come what may, and I think it will progress under Biden too. So under Mr. Trump as well, clearly he will exit Paris, but I think that, you know, the others will continue. I mean, Tom, you know, mentioned Brazil. We have wondered in the past whether Brazil might follow. They haven't. You know, he's had, you know, and I think that Bolsonaro would pay quite a big price in Latin America if he were to do that. So my guess is no one would follow him. And I think that the EU and now it looks like China would go ahead. I mean, you could even imagine a world where, you know, the EU and China were essentially, you know, really, you know, working together on this issue, and it was a way for China to make the Americans look bad. You know, I think that's partly why they made the decision in the first place. So I don't think diplomatically it's the end of the line. And actually, you've seen Japan and Korea follow China with these long-term goals in the course of the last week. And then, you know, I mean, others will talk about this too. You know, the real economy shifts are absolutely huge. I mean, people know that, but, you know, it's not just renewable energy being cheaper than fossil fuels in most parts of the world, not yet everywhere. Electric vehicles are going to be cheaper, even on a full life cost basis, in the next few years than convergent internal combustion engines. It's this transformation, this change is irreversible. It's inevitable. So and I think it will be reinforced by the work that, you know, Mark Carney is leading for the UK and also for the Secretary General on mainstreaming these considerations into investment decisions.
One thing I think about all those projections that we're seeing about, you know, future changes in fossil fuel price or future changes in electric car prices, they were all made before China and now Japan and Korea made their big announcements, which they themselves must have an effect on that, because China is just, you know, as you're fond of saying, Pete, it's just like the biggest everything. Yeah. Rachel, what are your thoughts on this question? What a Trump win would mean for climate change and green energy?
Well, I think there's an inexorableness, if that's even a word, to the clean energy transition. I think we're at tipping points now in terms of where capital is going. We're at tipping points in terms of where young people want to work. We're at tipping points, and so the front end of the energy transition is going, and it's just going to go faster. And when I talk to bankers, investment managers and asset owners, you know, they talk about the warp speed with which it feels like things are moving now. And these announcements from China, Korea and Japan, I think just will reinforce that. And so the question then is, for a Trump administration, do you continue to sort of like hold your hands up and sort of try to turn back the tide, or do you find in it things which should be important to a fiscally responsible, conservative government? Of course, the extent to which Trump has hollowed out that part of the Republican Party, I think, is a question. So I don't think they can turn back the tide. Do they want to, you know, find a way for an energy quote unquote independent, because that means different things to different people. United States in a clean energy race. I mean, the United States has all of the endowments it possibly could have to succeed in that clean energy race. Trump himself is perfectly capable of pivoting. This is somebody who could change his policy on a dime. I think there is a deep connection between the fossil fuel industry in this country and the Republican Party. Money infiltrates politics in a way which is quite extraordinary. And I think breaking that bond would be key. If it isn't broken, then I think it would be a very confusing at the level of federal government and legislation. But I think the states are voting with their feet. They're voting with the money. If you look at the amount of investment from California to Colorado to Arizona to Florida to Massachusetts, I mean, you know, that states are going in that direction because that's where the jobs are. That's where the resilience will come from. So you may have a continued disconnect between federal and state, but I think the state juggernaut is moving, and I don't see anything stopping that.
Excellent, thank you, Tom. Yes.
Yeah. No. Look, I mean, you know, the real drivers for these changes are people like Elon Musk in the United States, and you know, it's very hard to argue if you look at Tesla's share price and other cars are available that this isn't doing anything other than like attracting like and driving to an extraordinary degree. And I was recently talking to various people in Hungary who make quite a lot of the engines that we think of as German. And of course, they're in the same position as many of these coal states in the United States. They may be able to keep making carbon engines, internal combustion engines for a little while. But the reality is the switch to an electric engine and the loss of not just that technology, but also the gearbox and various other sort of specialist technologies means that if you don't make the change soon, then I think the drivers on the and Rachel was quite right to put it to identify it. Sorry, if you don't make the change soon, then the people who've invested much in a Republican victory or whatever victory in the United States are going to find themselves like the last person hanging on to a rising balloon. You need to move early.
Can I just say, I think it really poses a dilemma for some very big companies in the energy sector, but also transport, who throughout the Trump administration have been, understanding where the market's going, moving in that direction, but also playing nice with the Trump administration. A little bit of pressure, on the administration, don't do this, don't do that, but at the same time, so they've been hedging their bets, right? For example, on CAFE standards and the dispute between the federal government and California on fuel efficiency in vehicles. And I think that if you've got a second Trump term, that's really untenable now because the pace of the transition is going so fast. And so would you see some more captains of industry speaking more plainly to the federal government about what they need? Or would you see the continuance of lobbying and putting money into lobby groups that say one thing while you're saying another? I think it takes a bit of plausible deniability away from some of the captains of industry.
Excellent. Well, we've just got a few minutes left now, so I just wanted to go around the three of you and just ask if you've got any sort of closing thoughts on this. We're in less than a week away, as we said. I think definitely that what you've all been saying definitely puts to bed one of the rumours that one of the stories that you sometimes still hear, that basically another Trump win in the Paris Agreement is dead. I think you've definitely given the lie to that. But any sort of final closing thoughts before we sign off? Pete, how about you first?
I don't think I've got anything to say that I haven't already said. I think the UK has done a huge amount to coordinate some very exciting real economy bottom-up measures, and I think you can see that coming together very well with some of the top-down diplomatic stuff we've talked about. If it's Mr. Trump, I think it will put a particular premium on the UK working with the EU because we have shared interests. And I'm very struck that UK ministers don't necessarily have the relationships that they would have had automatically with counterparts in the old days, just from the automatic process of going to councils and so on. So I think that will, that might need a little bit of sort of specific effort to make it work. But no, I think that we're all in sort of violent agreement that a Biden scenario is smoother, but even under a Mr. Trump scenario, this is going to proceed.
Tom?
Look, I mean, I don't have much to disagree with there. I mean, I think the tipping point has been passed. I think we're on a curve towards climate action, and I think it will speed up as indicators of change grow. People like David Attenborough, I've already mentioned, are only going to help that process, not hinder it. And so I think there's going to be a huge transformation. Now, I think that the reality is that I think we're going to see greater leadership coming from non-traditional sources. I think actually countries like China are going to end up being leaders in this. I think the UK is going to be a leader in this. And I don't know who it's going to be in South America, but I suspect there will be a South American and African leaders as well, as the realization of desertification and climate change and of any number of different impacts are felt locally. We're going to see much more grassroots, particularly as this is likely to cause civil unrest in certain conurbations and mass areas of mass habitation, where I think we're going to see much more domestic pressure, much more local pressure being exerted on leaders.
Excellent. And Rachel, final thoughts from you. And you have to tell us, of course, also whether you're planning to stay up all night and watch it.
Yeah, I'll be up all night. I mean, I think living here, this feels like a viscerally important election, and I've got a lot of students from all over the world who are very anxious at the moment, and then a lot of furious sort of activity going on, trying to work out what happens under different scenarios. And living in Massachusetts, we've got a Republican governor. I think Trump or Biden wins, I don't think he changes his view about the long-term trajectory of Massachusetts. The mayor of Boston isn't going to change his view. They're committed to 2050 net zero. That happens. But I think, just to throw a curveball in right at the end, I think that so I think Pete spoke about the relationship between the UK and the EU if Trump wins. If Biden wins, I think there's a real risk to the COP26 presidency of the UK, unless fingers are pulled out by Tom and others, which is you're going to have a dialogue going on between the EU and China. You can have a dialogue going on between the US and the EU, US and China, and and things are moving. And honestly, the UK is not in the middle of that anymore because of sort of decisions that have been made, Brexit and others. And so you've got to exercise a presidency from the outside of the circle rather from the right in the middle of it. And I think that makes the task a little more complicated. Doesn't mean it can't be done. I think all eyes are on the UK government for the leadership that's needed. But if the US produces a president that really wants to go gung-ho for the next year, then that will pose its challenges for the UK presidency.
Excellent. All right. Well, thank you very much to our three panelists, Pete Betts, Rachel Kite, Tom Tugendhat. Thanks to everyone for joining. We will be emailing round to all of you who came on the call a short briefing that we've put together, which has got some facts and figures, for example, on the investment scenario that Rachel was talking about earlier on. So that should be with you. And there's also the option to get a recording of this press conference if you'd like it. So thanks once again, and hopefully see you on another Zoom call at some point in the near future. Bye for now.
Thank you.
Everyone.